welcome to everybody. I'm just delighted to see so many people here. So I'd like to acknowledge Dan Harvey, who I've been working with for 30 years as well, who's there, and 30-year practice. And I would also like to make mention of our 4 speakers, contributors today, who are going to make this a really exciting session, thoughtful, provocative, around reimagining the city. And in the time we're living in now, this confinement, this period of time where we see quieter streets than any of us have ever seen in our lives, heard more birdsong, actually breathed in fresher air on the city streets, possibly since the last occupation last spring with Extinction Rebellion. It's a very sobering and reflective time. I would like to thank and introduce Jane Riddiford, who is co-founder and co-director of Global Generation. And I'd like to introduce the director of the South London Gallery, Margot Heller. And she will then be followed by artist and activist Marie Culhane. And then we have Dan Raven-Ellison, who is a guerrilla geographer. So very warm thanks and welcome to our 4 speakers today. I would just like to start with mention of a long-term project that Dan and I have been working on for the last 13 years. And this is to do with radical planting and radical actions. Joseph Beuys, artist, regarded as one of the most influential artists in the 20th century, declared a need for radical planting. And in 1982, he planted the first tree for the inauguration of the 7th Documenta in the German city of Kassel. Documenta, as many of you will know, is a world-leading art exhibition that happens every 5 years. Beuys said, I want to be outside of the exhibition space. I want to be outside, and I want to be confronting all of the social and environmental problems that we have. And he planted the first of what then became the planting over the next few years of 7,000 trees. 7,000 oaks is an extraordinary artwork. Each tree is paired with a basalt marker, volcanic stone that was brought from a quarry about 30 kilometers from the German city of Kassel. Deep geological time kind of caught within, embodied within this stone, and the temporal presence of the trees he was planting. Mixed trees, not all oaks. And actually it takes up to 80 years for an oak to reach maturity. So in some levels, his work is still kind of growing in that sense. It's still possibly late juvenile, which makes our project, Beuys's Acorns, still very much in its infancy at 13 years old. But 7,000 oaks really, really encapsulated Beuys's vision of the transformation of consciousness. And he was, at a time when there were air quality was incredibly poor because of acid rain, urbanization in the city of Kassel, and of course many other cities in the 70s, which is also termed the Great Acceleration, was ramping up. Joseph Beuys saw 7,000 oaks as encapsulating this living, breathing, regenerative artwork for this transformation of this body of consciousness, where we could actually move socially, ecologically, economically, politically towards having an atmosphere that was concordant with a thriving well-being for multi-species and for humans in every possible way. So in 2007, and very importantly, he also called for every town and city to become forest-like. 2007, Dan and I collected hundreds of acorns from Joseph Beuys's fallen acorns from 7,000 oaks. Could I have an image, please, Polly? And this has become a sort of a print work that we did in 2009, which, also kind of sales of which help support the project from time to time. There's an image here of Joseph Beuys planting the first tree. And we also have, in 1987, he didn't live to see the final planting. The final tree was planted in 1987 by his son. Joseph Beuys died in 1986. This was a phenomenally demanding project for him. He was kind of courting much controversy with you know, a conservative leading government. The mayor of Kassel was more socialist leaning, but even so, huge amounts of money, massive input, volunteer effort, you know, all across the board to get this project happening. So we collected, and I'm just going to show this image of, which I just think is incredible, of when he placed all the 7,000 basalt markers into the square. Just extraordinary. I mean, just so bold, and every time a tree was planted, then one of these basalt markers would be taken. So this is planted across the city, out into the kind of the further suburbs of the city as well. Next image, please, Polly. So yeah, we collected acorns from these two trees, the larger one, the first tree planted in 82, the smaller one in 87 by his son. Brought them back to this country, and we've been germinating and growing these trees for the last 13 years. We have about 200 surviving trees, 15 of which have been planted in various institutes, botanical gardens throughout France. And you may ask why France, and actually the inspiration for us to go and collect the acorns in the first place was a wonderful book which many of you will know by the French author Jean Genot, the man who planted trees. We read that book and just had this kind of complete intuitive hunch that this was the inspiration for Joseph Beuys's starting 7,000 Oaks, and actually later found out through research that that was the case. But bearing in mind as well that Joseph Beuys was one of the co-founder members of the German Green Movement. So we were having some quite intense conversations through the Tipping Point organization. Can art affect political change? And many artists would say, no, it can't. And I would say, actually, what about Joseph Beuys? I think, you know, there are artists who absolutely affect political change, not just Joseph Beuys, has a much longer history, and now a continuing presence of activism, as we can see as well. Next image, please, Polly. We've shown throughout many different venues throughout the UK. And whenever we show these trees, we always, next image, please, we always have what we call a kind of a public, it's like a live open-ended research project, and we're always engaging with architects, environmental lawyers, the extraordinary Polly Higgins, who very sadly and untimely passed away last year, writers such as Jay Griffiths, geographers, environmentalists, scientists, ecologists. We've had about 60 different people over the course of the project who have been present in, it's like a live public research program that goes alongside every time the display of the trees. Next image, please. And these are the trees in 2019 on the Holding Nursery. So next image, please. They were shown at Bloomberg Arcade last year, which is the first time we'd shown a significant amount of the trees in about 2015. We actually let the trees rest after what we called a trees on tour throughout France. So the trees now were due to be opening at Tate Modern. And, you know, prior to lockdown, we were just about to put forward the public engagement program. We'd sort of agreed terms, and then we had this email from Tate saying the galleries are closing imminently, and we couldn't show the trees. So it's on hold, possibly for next year, depending how this plays out. Interestingly, when we were showing these trees at Bloomberg, we had a message from the Holding Nursery, which is based in Kent, which still had over 100 of the trees, saying they had just been given a clean bill of health about not having the oak processionary moth infection. And every county in the City of London, every borough in the City of London is infected with oak processionary moth. Surrey, and it's spreading, and they said you cannot bring the trees back. Oh, we thought, right, we've now got 50 trees which have to stay in London. So we thought, how are we going to deal with this? And we had a conversation with Polly, and she said, you need to, she said, listen, how about having a conversation with Jane Riddiford at Global Generation? They're just about to close down the Skip Garden and open up the Story Garden just behind the British Library by the Francis Crick Institute. So we had this extended conversation with Jane, and, you know, to get to know each other, for her to understand where Dan and I were coming from with this project. But we grew to really understand each other and, you know, our kind of practice and our approach. And she and her team really kindly, and to our huge relief, said yes, we will house the trees. And Bloomberg stepped forward, and they gave us two years of kind of support for maintenance of the trees, which has been fantastic. Excuse me. So this is a point now where we have 120 trees still down in Kent that probably do need to come up to London for exhibition, hopefully at Tate Modern next year. This is also was meant to be happening with their Power to Change programme. Tate declared a climate and ecological emergency last year. And a series of art assemblies was going to be happening. So there are multiple losses here, and there are multiple cultural casualties as a result of lockdown and many strains and stresses that many of us are feeling, without a doubt, in amongst the kind of this greater extension of period of reflection. But this gives me a chance to introduce Jane Riddiford, and I'm really, really pleased that Jane is here to talk to us about her project. The more I understand, the more I hear Jane talk, meet her team, the more inspired and full of respect I am. So Jane, thank you so very much, and I'm going to hand over to you to talk about how Global Generation came to be in your vision, and how you may start to, and how you are reimagining the city.
And hello everybody, it's really great to be with you, and yeah, just to share something of Global Generation and our trajectory, because it has very much been about bringing the spirit of the forest to the city. We began back in 2004, and I didn't know of Joseph Beuys' work at that time, but during the course of our work since then, people used to say to me, "Oh, Jane, you really should check out Joseph Beuys. You should really check him out." And it wasn't really until I met Polly and Heather that this came about, and I understood, and it kind of revealed more of the deeper ground behind our work. This was back in 2004, and whilst we were a London-based organisation, we had an opportunity we were working actually in Kentish Town, and we had an opportunity to take a group of young people to a place called Pertwood Farm in Wiltshire, and many of them had never left the city before, never seen the stars at night or heard the badgers in the undergrowth. And something happened for them and for me. In the mornings we would get up and we would take a silent walk, and at night, like you do, and when you can see the stars, we would sit around a campfire and look at them. And I knew that somehow we had to continue this work. And I also knew that our work wasn't just about giving young people this experience in the countryside. I was interested in what does that look like in the middle of the city, and how could we recreate that? Next slide, please. And our first opportunity, we met somebody who owned an office building actually in Gray's Inn Road, and he gave us an opportunity to do something on the roof of the office building. But I said to him, we'll only do it if the young people we're working with can be involved in doing the work. And he agreed, and that somehow was a breaking down of barriers, because many of the young people we worked with would have seen the office buildings as out of bounds and not a place for them. And the people in the office, whilst they might have wanted to connect to the communities around them, very often, as we all know, that just doesn't happen. And we were able to create, a brown roof ecology up there. Actually, there was all sorts of things. It's made of recycled sewage pellets and recycled glass from Canary Wharf, and we also got logs and branches from Hampstead Heath, and I think it was probably the only rooftop where you would have found a lesser stag beetle that came with everything. But more than that happened. It was that actually creating this rooftop garden, and in a small way, bringing the spirit of the forest to the city enabled connections. And so pretty soon we had the teenagers teaching the people in the office about soil fertility and how soil works and the seasons grow. So that was the beginning of a feeling, our projects should be in these kinds of spaces. And also because a lot of the young people we work with, I mean, you know, they were kind of like, we don't do dirt mess, it's not our kind of thing, but somehow this juxtaposition, it appealed to them. So then we'll go to the next slide. So then we had an opportunity to create the first skip garden. I don't know if any of you've been to went to the skip garden in King's Cross, but we were there for about 10 years, and right in the middle of the development site, and our first site was opposite St Pancras Station. And again, we involved local young people in building the garden with us, as well as the different businesses who worked on site and the different construction guys. And again, it acted as a social glue and a way for conversations to happen. So there was a kind of social ecology that happened alongside learning about how, you know, growing plants and those kinds of spaces. So if we go to the next slide, very much our work we developed over time an approach we call I, we, and the planet. So inner, outer, and collective. I mean, that has a whole kind of philosophical tradition, which in a way connects to Plato's beauty, truth, and goodness. And somehow when we started consciously thinking about those three dimensions of experience, something else happened. As Plato said, goodness happens. So there was a kind of an energy. And for me, that very much also connected with an action research journey that I began in about 2008. And if some of you are familiar with that approach, it is very much about understanding ourselves, working collectively with other people, and the broader systemic changes we can make. And also within action research, there's about the intersection between the past and the present and the future. And all of those things were present in our work as it unfolded. If we go to the next slide. So alongside the very practical hands-on doing, nature connection and opportunities for working with different ways of knowing and giving young people a chance to really take note of and their experience and give expression to that. We go to the next slide. Here's a young construction apprentice doing free-fall writing, sitting in one of the skips. And the next slide. And these are some of the construction guys working on site. And I remember it just opened up conversations for them about the kinds of background they came from. And I think because we were working in the middle of a construction site, we were working with developers, we were working with people that for very good reason, many people would see the organizations as questionable and as ecociders. And I guess we have been quite committed from the get-go to try and avoid a binary of us and them, and standing on the outside and pointing fingers, and hoping and seeing on some occasion that by building relationship with people, we could help, at least in a small way, seed some shifts of worldviews where people saw themselves as separate from the planet, and feeling that actually that was a contribution we could make. So if we go to the next slide. This was the last skip garden on the King's Cross development. Some of you might recognise where it was, just beyond Central St Martin's, which you can see there That was at the time also when the natural swimming pool was still there. But one of the things also in our projects is we involved everybody in the building of them. Sometimes we say the gardens are a garden of 1,000 hands. But this was actually a collaboration with the Bartlett School of Architecture. So students had an opportunity to, I think it was the first time an architecture school had actually done something that went like a build project that went beyond an exhibition. So we had to get planning permission for it. But again, we involved the local community in the build as well. And then if we go to the next slide, that's just the skip garden when it was finished.
Got a couple more minutes, Jane.
What?
Just 2 or 3 more minutes, okay?
Okay, great. We're nearly there.
Thanks.
So, yeah, it is about 90% reclaimed material. But one of the reasons for doing that is not obviously just for the environmental considerations, was because of, you know, all of the material brought stories with it about where it came from. Okay, next slide. And then 2 or 3 years ago, we developed a project in Southwark in what was the Daily Mail print works. And this was the paper garden. And we're working with local children inside a woven paper yurt made of all the leftover newsprint and architectural plans and newsreel rolls. And yeah, if we go to the next slide, and there we very much work with storytelling. I guess some people could say we've made a feature of exercising some of these inhospitable places, and we work with seasonal celebrations because, yeah, how to bring out the life that's always been there beneath the concrete. This is the winter solstice. If we go to the next slide, the summer solstice. And then, as Heather said, last year, we began the skip garden in Kingsford Cross finished, and we were given 2 acres of land between the British Library and the Francis Crick, and right beside King's Cross Station. And that will be there for maybe 3 years or so, and it's a bit unknown. We travel hopefully that the leave date gets extended, but yes, and this is where we were fortunate enough to meet Heather, and the boys Oaks came and are with us, and they really helped bring out, I would say, a mythological dimension of the space, and something magical started to happen. People were just drawn to be with them, whether that was the people who worked roundabout. I remember one occasion doing a family Saturday and a group of Bangladeshi mothers sitting inside the Oaks, and we told a story and we lit a fire, and then they started telling us stories of their life and their families in Bangladesh, and they've asked if they could camp there, obviously when we start moving about. Yeah. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that's the agricultural bowser that goes with the Oaks, and apparently you painted it pink so that it was a reminder of the yacht, the Extinction Rebellion rock.
Yeah, it's the pink as well from you know, Culture Declares it was the pink that we launched with in 2019. That's wonderful, Jane. Is there another image?
Just two more images.
Yeah, and I think
that's always our reminder of what is our contribution to climate change, and at the moment, very much what is our contribution to the emergency we're in. So I've just got 2 slides. We've just really, that one and the next slide, we've really increased our food production and us providing food to the neighborhood, you know, local families roundabout. And we've also produced something called the stay-at-home garden, which we can share with you. So really using the garden to seed what people can do at home.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Jane. And this is really, I think there's so much resonance with the Story Garden and the work you've been doing over many moons with your team, with the work that Margot Heller, from director of the South London Gallery, will now discuss. So handing over to you, Margot. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and hello everybody. It's lovely to be here. And I just wanted to make a special mention and thank you to Kelly Hill for having suggested Heather invite me to talk today about the Orosco Garden. So I don't know how many of you know the South London Gallery, but it's at 65 Peckham Road. Like all galleries around the country and the world at the most of the world at the moment, we're closed. But we will be reopening in the future, and when we do, the Orosco Garden is open to the public at the weekend. So I hope some of you will feel moved to go and have a look. Yes, so this is an image of the Orosco Garden. Just while I tell you a bit about the history of it, the garden opened to the public in October 2016, so coming up for 4 years ago. But prior to that, it was 2 years in the planning. And it was, Gabriel Orozco is an internationally acclaimed Mexican artist. He had a big retrospective at Tate Modern a few years ago. He's exhibited all over the world. I've known him for many years. He's a wonderful artist. And then he collaborated with 6A architects, with whom South London Gallery has a long-standing relationship, having worked with them on a number of developments of our buildings over the past, 15 years. And then we worked with botanists from Kew Garden. So it was a really beautiful collaboration, as I said, over a 2-year period. But just to kind of go back to the origins of the idea, and the kernel of the idea is that the South London Gallery had this kind of paved outdoor space, which I will attempt to show you a picture of in due course. And I had been to many private views at the gallery over the years prior to working there, having been there now for 19 years. And that outdoor space, although it was quite basic, was very much part of the experience of visiting the South London Gallery and going to openings and so on. So actually, right from the beginning, I thought this is a space with potential. And when you start a new job, you do that blue skies thinking, what would I do if money were no object? Well, one option would have been to build a second gallery in this quite, not a small, well, it is small as a garden, but it's not a tiny area. You could have made a very decent sized gallery by building on that plot. But I decided that actually this outdoor space was very much part of the character of the South London Gallery, and that I wanted to preserve it. In the intervening years, the various building projects kind of took priority, and so it was only, as I said, 6 years ago that actually doing a project on this space came to the top of the list. But right from the beginning, as I said, when I first started, I had this idea that you could turn this space into something really special that was actually an artwork in itself. So rather than commissioning a landscape gardener to come and do some work in the space and then commissioning an artist to create works to put within it, I wanted the artist to very much be coming up with this concept. So the garden in its entirety is the artwork. And in fact, the Orosco Garden is now part of the South London Gallery's permanent collection, with this idea that it's going to be there for many decades to come, to further develop and grow, which hopefully will be increasingly beautiful over the years. So my inspiration in that was twofold. It firstly came from having known, like many people around the world, of Derek Jarman's garden, and then the shock when I actually went to visit it of how actually tiny it is, and to think that such a small outdoor space could have such a big reputation was something that I thought was really inspiring. And then in parallel with that, in 2002, I visited Mexico and had the opportunity to go to Oaxaca, where there is an extraordinary ethnobotanical garden in a 16th century Santo Dominican monastery. And it is a cactus garden, but it was devised in collaboration with artists Francesco Toledo and Luis And so that kind of sparked something as well. So interestingly, when it came to commissioning an artist, the artist I chose was Mexican, so maybe there was a subconscious kind of reference to that. And this shows one of the early drawings. So 6A architects translated Gabriele Orosco's drawings digitally into these rather beautiful plans. And Gabrielle's work is she's very much about observing kind of tiny things in nature and often an urban environment, creating photographs from them, or he's as well known, if not more so, for his sculptures and also for his paintings and drawings, in which circles are a repetitive motif. In his own words, he is obsessed with circles. And then you can see from some of these drawings that he kind of drew on top of these digitally produced sketches to gradually evolve the plans for the garden. And I'm just, oops, yeah. So you can see here, this is what the garden, well, actually the garden was much more rough and ready than this. This is probably in about 2010, this photograph was taken, when we had just opened that Claw Studio building, which you can see in the design of it, those pivot doors that create this relation, emphasize the relationship between indoor and outdoor, which 6A so brilliantly realized. So we did kind of brush up the old paving stones a bit and buy some new garden furniture from the local store. But so it was a pleasant space, but it was completely transformed, as you can see here in this quick clip, the geometry of Gabrielle being superimposed onto that space to create the garden as it is now. Now, a very important part of the brief for this was this walkway. I'm just looking for where the reference is to this, because this garden backs onto a housing estate, coincidentally called So Gardens Estate, which has an above average amount of green space within it. And on that estate, we've been running workshops in a space called Art Block. You can see it here. Well, actually in different spaces on the estate. This is the most recent space that we have. And we run after school provision for children. And then there's a pathway, which sadly I don't have an image of, but a rough and ready track that kind of effectively leads to the back of that garden. So part of the brief was to include, that walkway. Sorry, just trying to jump to an image of it. Yep. So you can see there the walkway, how that links the back of the garden to the estate. So by making this very simple intervention, people talk about barriers to access to culture and to art institutions, but there was a very real physical barrier, and just by creating this small walkway, it made a really big difference to the relationship with the estate, to really consolidate the partnership that we've built over many years. And as part of that, we created this small reception area so that when people come in through that walkway, when the residents come in, there's somebody there to welcome them, whereas prior to this project, they would have been confronted by a brick wall. So we then run drop-in workshops on Sunday for families, and some of the participants come through the main entrance, and some through some children that are regular attenders at Art Block, some others from living on the estate. We also run workshops and coffee mornings for elderly residents. We have barbecues at Christmas parties and all sorts of artist talks and events for residents, which has just become so much easier because of this having this garden provision. You can see here, the way Gabriele Orosco took on the brief was quite brilliant, I think, and he's created different zones through this circular geometry, and then this circle in the middle. As you can see, when it rains, it fills up with water, and there's literally a plug in the middle of it, so you can open it out. But it's also being used here by a group of children that we work with regularly. We have, you know, the schools group amazingly just love this garden. Whereas if you'd given a brief to an artist to design a garden for children, the last thing they would have done would have been to choose a lot of grey, hard cornered York stone. But it is incredibly inspiring to children. And Gabrielle's kind of has had a long-standing interest in board games, and interestingly it does kind of operate like a board game in some senses. And another area of his idea was to create this kind of micro landscape. So the mound that you can see in the middle there is, like, he calls that the hill, and then there's the pond, and so on. So there are these different aspects. We've also used it for performances. And Gabrielle really embraced that flexibility of use.
Wonderful.
I'm just conscious that one more minute, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
On track. So another kind of key idea is that this is like an urban ruin. And I think what Gabrielle did brilliantly was to create something which doesn't look like it's this alien being that has landed in the middle of this urban environment, but then his choice of materials has been quite brilliant in kind of linking in with the surrounding area, because you can actually get great aerial views of the garden from, you can just see in the top right hand corner of that image one of the blocks on the housing estate. And this rather dark picture was taken by a colleague who went, you know, on her own to go and water the plants the day before yesterday, and just to show you how much the garden has started to flourish.
Wow.
And grow. And so Gabrielle's idea was very much that this should be like an urban, you can see there the walkway, should become an urban ruin, and you can see the plants all growing between the paving stones, which are from York stone, and that idea that, you know, there's this fight in a way, or kind of merging between the urban environment on the one hand, the built environment, and then the natural environment, and this idea that the natural environment will gradually just overtake the space to become ever greener. Thank you.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I think many of us are going to be making a beeline there, Margot, as soon as we're out of lockdown. It just looks absolutely exquisite. It's been really, I love the intimacy of the space, but the way that it has complete access for all these children, the people who live on the housing estate. I think it's absolutely really remarkable. So congratulations all round. And now we're going to go to Anne-Marie Culhane, who is an artist and activist, and also and she's also studied permaculture, and she's going to take us up north, I think, to Sheffield. Is that right, Anne?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Polly, have you got my slides? Great. Okay. So thank you for inviting me to be here, and I'm going to talk, give you a whistle-stop tour through some different cities and towns in the UK through the lens of orchards and trees and creating culture with people. I'm an eco-social artist and activist. My practice is relational, collaborative, and I work on the ground with different people in different communities. As Heather said, key influences for me are permaculture design. I'm also really inspired by the work of Welfare State International and their rites of passage work, Common Ground, of course, Joanna Macy, eco-philosopher, and my work with working with the family of Encounters Arts. So I'm going to talk through some projects around food in cities and towns, focusing on trees and orchards. These projects take place in Exeter, in Exmouth, in Plymouth, in Loughborough and in Sheffield, so outside of London, and practicing on very different scales. So the first slide here, probably the slide that brings the biggest smile to my face. So this is the first, the big eye-opener for me was running a project called Abundance in Sheffield in 2007. We posed the question of what if we could harvest waste fruit across the city that Stephen had already identified was growing all over the place, and we redistributed that across the city to people that might it or might want it or might be able to use it. So we put up posters in shops and cafes, and this is partly what happened. So this is my Southview Crescent, Sharrow, my house. This is my front room. We couldn't basically get in the door after about 3 days. There was so much fruit, and we're not just talking apples, we're talking plums, pears, green gages, so many different varieties. And it was basically like opening the door of this little house and just this deluge of fruit pouring in from across the city. I couldn't believe what I was experiencing, and it was truly sort of revelationary for me. So from now on, my peripheral vision whenever I'm in a city is around seeking out blossom and looking for fruit trees, and that's how I navigate spaces. So my mental map of Sheffield is where the fruit trees are across the city. I don't know the street names, but I know where all the fruit trees are, and that's how I see the city. So for me, when I think of Sheffield, which is a northern industrial city, I think of it as one big orchard with houses in between. So for me, that's a shift in the way that I experience the whole city and the possibilities of what cities can be. Next slide, please. So this is just some of our experiences of harvesting with the many volunteers that were part of those first couple of years and are still involved in Sheffield in harvesting fruit. It was a lot of fun. We had many volunteers. We were distributing to Sure Start centres and homeless centres, and we still had more, making jams and chutneys, building a community around this resource. There's so much fruit. We import 95% of our fruit. We throw away a third of our food, and this that we could grow here that's already here being wasted, and we could grow lots more. So for me, this is a really exciting possibility. And in terms of our food security, which is very real for me in terms of the climate and ecological emergency, if we're going to be growing more of our fruit, which we definitely can do, and we can grow more and more of that now, actually, because climate change opens up different niches for a greater diversity of fruit, we need to be getting that canopy layer in place now. So there's a very practical underpinning to the way I'm looking at fruit, but there's also a joy and a celebration and a cultural aspect to the work that I'm doing. So next slide, please. So abundance opened up for me lots of possible layers of discovery and research and artistic collaboration around waste, around redistribution, exchange. The bottom right picture is the Encounters shop in Sharrow, which was set up as a fruit exchange. We've got this huge free gift from nature, and then we played with it as artists and explored how we might work conversations and dialogue and exchange of information working with this resource. We used it for activism. The top right is in Meadowhall Shopping Centre, where we wheeled in our cart of free fruit. There was ample opportunity for community connection and questions around commons and common land. A lot of these fruit trees were in gap sites or in churchyards or hospital grounds not being used. So the handbook, which there's a link to in the bottom right, shared all of the learning from those first 2 years with people all around the world. It's a free download, and there's now an active network of abundance groups around the country. So next slide, please. This kind of distilled into this small Orchard City Manifesto, which I've got here, which was me thinking, okay, so if this waste resource is put, if that's in Sheffield, that's going to be in a lot of other cities. We're going to have this existing tree resource that's not being maximised on. And how do we then fill in the gaps? How do we find out where the fruit poverty is in a city? How can we then create a vision for a whole city that might be looking at a productive landscape as well as a tree-filled landscape mixed in with everything else that's there? And so the manifesto looks at expanding the edible fruitscape that already exists and developing a thriving fruit economy and providing ongoing inspiration for connection, celebration and healthy living in our cities, to experience the metropolis as a place where people live amongst the trees. So what if the city is a big rambling orchard with buildings in between? What if we can be using urban hotspots and walls and microclimates and urban glass houses and atriums to grow the more exotic varieties? And obviously there's a whole list of different ideas here that open up the possibility of how we could have an orchard city. So next slide. We'll stick with that one. So I was then thinking about, okay, so if we can be growing more fruit and nut trees, what about pathways and routes across the city and towns? And I was thinking about sustrands and all of the bike networks that we have across the country. And these would be obvious places that we could fill up with fruit resources. And it would also massively benefit the biodiversity. So I was invited by Loughborough University to create a 1.5 kilometre fruit route on the campus. It's the second biggest campus in the UK. So on this map, there's 150 different fruit trees. And the narrative and the story of those trees is around diversity. So there's a huge diversity of different varieties. And some of the varieties are right on the edge of their range. So what we were doing was sort of pushing conversations around climate change. So we've got almonds here, we've got peaches growing here. We're just seeing what's actually going to work there. There's quite a lot of experimentation in what we've planted. And it just means that when we're doing our repeated walks around the route, we can have those more interesting depth conversations about the impact of these trees and the changing climate. So what happens with fruit routes is we start to create a curiosity, food, biodiversity-based community culture, which spills beyond the boundaries of the university. So community come onto the campus, students and university staff come to Fruit Roots events. We've had 9 turns of the wheel now, so it's 9 years old, and events and harvest festivals bring people back and back into the, I guess, ritualized walking of this path and the visiting of the route. And we have participatory performances, events, the sharing of food, often in a ritualized way, sharing of knowledge across local people and university academics. And we pay attention to the more than human world, who was here before who was here before the campus was here. So there's a lot of really practical observation of the natural world, as well as the more reflective and creative. So next slide. So this led on to a project called Flow in Exeter. So what you're seeing here is the river running through this down the spine of the centre of Exeter, and there's a big park that runs along that river. It's about 6 kilometres long. I co-created the Flow Orchard, which is 5 kilometres of fruit and nut trees running along the park. This is the poorer side of town, so we can see most of the red dots. That's the side of the town that's more at risk of floods, and what the route has created is an enhanced foraging pathway for people, and a way linking up different communities that run along the river. So the next slide, please. So now the trees are settling into place. For me, there's a whole nother layer of work that can happen, which is around the site being a venue, a site for events, walks and contemporary rituals that pick up threads from the past and weave these into new patterns of place and people that then can go on into the future. So there's practical care, there's ongoing learning, and then there's developing a mythic or a sacred sense of place that happens. Next slide, please. So bringing together imagination, myth, dream and vision, and touching into deeper, longer rhythms and cycles to cut across the fast-paced 24/7 of the city to create a sense of re-enchantment. And so I don't make many objects in my work, but this is one of the objects that I've made, which has been a key part of this process. And these are a number of different projects, where this is a wassail bowl, which I designed and made out of cherry wood from Exeter, from a felled tree, a tree that had come down. And this has passed through many, many hands around many, many circles as part of the work. So next slide, please. So the trees are in place. In this kind of work where there's new planting happening, new traditions start to get co-evolved with the people who are living in these places. In a sense, we're often reclaiming space. So in a university campus, we're saying this is a public space. A lot of people are scared to even walk onto the campus, and Fruit Roots gives them permission. or in Exeter, we're planting in a public park. So suddenly there's a sense of real personal connection to a particular tree or a set of trees, and people start to develop a real sort of deep sense of relationship with that space. So this is an artwork that I made with a colleague, Paul Keneally, and in a sense, this is what we're doing. We're opening up a space to this is reading tea leaves. And what you're seeing here are plants that have been harvested from the land that these people are sitting on. And then they're looking at the tea and reading into the future. And in a sense, this is what we're doing. We are using our imaginations to create our own futures. Drawing from the knowledge and that the plants hold for us.
We may have to draw it in now just because we're hitting midday. Is that okay?
Can I do one more?
One more, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we're losing a little bit of time at the moment.
Okay, so I'm going to end with a quote from John Fox, which is in such a context as the climate and ecological emergency, an artist would become a facilitator and a fixer, a celebrant and a stage manager, a visionary linking the past and the future, a poetic diviner, a shamanic lasso, a trickster mongrel, a revealer of layers of perception, and the holder of what used to be called spiritual energy. This kind of artist would also acknowledge the artist in all of us and offer testament to the innate creativity recurring in every generation and every community, where the intuitive is given freedom to participate and collaborate, and where regeneration is of the soul and not of economics. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I think that's a very fitting quote from John Fox to pass over to Dan Raven-Ellison, who is a guerrilla geographer. I'm going to hand over to you, Dan. We're going to have to probably put this into 10 minutes, so we then have 10 minutes for breakout sessions and 10 minutes to get feedback. Is that okay?
Yeah, I'll time myself.
Okay, I'll time you too. Go.
Great. So my name's Dan. I'm a guerrilla geographer, founder of the London National Park City. I'm a former geography teacher, and I live in Hanwell in West London, which is very far West London, out towards Southall. And I'm going to be sharing with you sort of 3 different projects that I've initiated and an opportunity that you might be interested in as well. So the first one is a project that I started on a couple of years ago now, called The UK in 100 Seconds. And essentially my insight was that I was very aware of the fact that, especially in the tabloid media and a lot of the media, there's been this rhetoric within this country and also increasingly in the United States as well, around the idea that Britain is full. And I got thinking about the idea that Britain's full, there's no space for people, there's no space for nature, there's no space for affordable housing. I got thinking about my understanding of the UK as a geographer, and came to realise that although I've travelled the UK extensively, I've walked across all the national parks and all the cities in the UK, then I had no idea what it looks like. It's just too big for my brain to get my head around. So I ran a poll with Friends of the Earth and found that 1 in 3 people in the country think that nearly half of the country is built on, when the actual number is somewhere between 5 and 7%. So I decided to make a short film where I'd go on a 100-metre walk, and every 1 metre of my walk and every second of the film shot from above is 1% of what the country looks like from the air. I'm not going to show the film now, but if you look at my Twitter and search UK in 100 seconds, then you'll find it. And what it does is it gives you a different way of looking at Britain, and I think very clearly shows that we have an incredible amount of space that could be taken from livestock and given to nature, and maybe a bit of housing in some places as well. Then a bit before that, about 7, 8 years ago now, I began asking a question around what if we made London a national park city? And it's great to hear Anne-Marie sort of using that power of what if question. This was a campaign that was started 7 years ago, and last year London was launched as the world's first national park city, with there being other cities around the world that are interested in this approach too. And really the main insight around this is the idea that firstly, national parks are really cool. They're problematic, they've got lots of problems, but national parks are really cool. And what if we could take inspiration from them to make cities greener, healthier, wilder, to reconsider different forms of inspiring people, and to protect nature and to have a better relationship with nature as well. And central to that premise is this idea that firstly, that cities are landscapes, they're habitats, that urban life is just as valuable as rural life, that there's more people in cities and more people have more power in cities to create the sort of transformations that we need, tackle the climate and health and ecological emergencies. And that unlike traditional national parks, the way in which you foster power in an urban environment is by creating a movement of people, a movement that actually has already existed in London for hundreds of years around making the city greener, healthy and wilder, but thinking about how we can scale up some of those practices more quickly and more equitably across the city. So some key points around the National Park City is that people are the solution, not the problem. It's culture that is needed to drive these changes, that we are all story makers and story creators and story spreaders. But what makes a National Park City different to other ways of thinking about maybe initiatives is firstly that it's a landscape approach. So everyone is included, everyone everywhere is included, whether they like it or not, whether they're aware or not, whether they're doing good things or bad things, everyone in that landscape is included. And crucially, it's not just an initiative, it's forever. It will last forever. And in that sense, through all these things, the National Park City is about reframing the purpose of the city and our identities within it. So how do people hope and dream within a National Park City? What might their aspirations be? And so the sort of really simple theory of change around the National Park City in London is around two key questions. One, around what if? So what if we had more otters in our rivers and canals? What if our canals were clean enough that you could go swimming in them? What if we had climbing walls up the side of buildings? What if there was radically more outdoor learning in schools? What if streets were 10 times greener? And that then takes you on to the next question, where you get enough people dreaming and hoping and expecting something different because they live in a National Park City, that they start saying, why not? So if I live in a National Park City, why isn't there good nature-based learning in my school? Why isn't the canal clean enough to swim in it? What do you mean you want to build in my local park? You build up and change the framing and the expectations of the city in that way. But we can only do it in London, and we've only done it in London because of all the projects that have done across the city over years so far. So I'm not going to go over everything that's happened around the London National Park City over the last few years, but an exciting thing that happened on Sunday was we launched the National Park City Foundation launched our first 54 National Park City Rangers. These are not traditional rangers as you would think of them, as people that pull like sheep out of hedges and that kind of thing. These are storytellers, artists, filmmakers. They are catalysts. They are fungi specialists. They are rewilders. They're air cleaning experts, nature-based solutions wizards, all kinds of people. And their purpose is to take those things that we know are already working well in the city and find ways to spread them more quickly so that more people can benefit from them. We've got 50 now. The plan is that there'll be 2,000 volunteer National Park City Rangers within 5 years, which might sound like a lot of people, but when you consider that there will be about 10 million people living in London by then, actually, you know, it's not so many, maybe. Another quick project. About a year ago, I started really thinking about footpaths in the UK and about how walking is really key for not only tackling some of our own personal problems in terms of thinking about ourselves, our spirituality, our emotions, our health, our well-being, but also some of the biggest problems we face at the moment, from the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, the impending financial crisis, the air quality crisis. Actually, walking more is one of the key solutions. So I got thinking about how footpaths are around the UK and realised that although we're very fortunate to have about 200,000 kilometres of public rights of way, they are really in a mess. They're not really clear what they do or who they serve. And although historically some have connected populated places to populated places, why we originally had them, in the most part, the ones that do that have lost their way in terms of how they're named. So they're a bit elusive, I think, for the public. The National Cycle Network does an awful lot of really great work on addressing the issue for cyclists, but falls short for walkers. So I got thinking about what a network might look like to connect up all the towns and cities in the UK and many villages through what I call the Slow Ways network. At the beginning of lockdown, a core team of volunteers helped to plan out a series of routes. And over the last 3 weeks, 450 volunteers from across the country have mapped out nearly 6,000 routes stretching 80,000 kilometres, which is the equivalent of 2 laps of the equator. So this map you see here is the first draft of an England and Wales map of these slow ways connecting up. And I think what's exciting about this proposition isn't just about reconnecting with the idea of walking to your neighbouring town or settlement, but instead you could also think about, if you wanted to get from Falmouth to Huddersfield, how you can daisy chain up multiple routes where your sleeping space and eating space each night is a settlement where there are people and services and food and somewhere where you can sleep, unlike many of the current rural routes, which go from countryside to countryside and don't really have that same functionality that were at their roots. So I'm interested in how we think about places, how we can inspire other people to think differently about places, and through that, make places better together. And I was on a walk a couple of years ago now with Guy, who leads the Surrey Hills area of outstanding natural beauty, who connected me through to Dan and Heather. We sort of came up with this idea to reimagine the London City region, thinking about the London City region really is the south of Britain by global standards. That for British people will seem like a very threatening idea that London is so big, but when you consider that Sydney in Australia is 10,000 kilometres, London, in terms of its footprint, yes, is Greater London, but ecologically, culturally, in terms of transport planning, housing, it is the south of Britain. So how can we reimagine the south of Britain and what the city region should look like in 20 years' time? Not what could it be like or what will it be like, but what should it look like? So we are putting out an open call to artists, architects, cartographers, imagineers, realists, landscape architects, anyone who's interested, to come up with visualizations of what the landscape could look like, what it should look like in the future, in 20 years, 200 years, 2,000 years from now. And it could be about designing just a fragment of that landscape in a way that could be scaled, a bit like a slime mold or something like that, or it could be a vision for the entire landscape. It could be a weaving, it could be words, it could be photography, whatever you like. The prize itself is publicity, exposure, and the promise that from the partners that you can see on screen here, the areas of outstanding natural beauty and the national parks, that we will put the winners, and there'll be more than one winner, in front of the noses of the decision makers who could potentially bring them to life. So it really is about transforming the future for real. Thank you very much. That was bang on 10 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, just very briefly, because I know we've only got a few minutes, we spoke about, it was summarised beautifully by Mike at the end of the session, about the connection between walking, nature, activism, story, providing new opportunities for connection across and with communities. So we were speaking about that connecting and going deep at the same time, and that maybe this opportunity allowed for more of that connecting in a new way.
That's great. Thank you. Anybody else like to talk? Yeah. 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 Thank you. Go. Yeah.
Do you want to go?
Sorry, yes, okay, I wasn't sure then. Yes, so I can very quickly go through what we talked about. We were thinking about how do we create the spirit of the forest in the city, and we were saying that finding some way of creating a grove, or groves which are connected by roots. And somebody was saying that the walking and cycling routes between existing spaces, and now that COVID has actually changed the way we are currently living, now might be the great opportunity for mayors to actually do something more with those. We were really excited by the fruit trails and thinking about green arteries, making places for reflection, and trying to look at reducing the heavy dependence on vehicles, and thinking about pocket gardens and sacred spaces, and maybe trying to think about it in an intergenerational way, as well as specific younger people, or, you know, and getting people to open their gardens to be part of that extension.
Great, thank you so much.
And
That's
in
really
the
interesting.
chat, Claire, head in. Claire, you had something you wanted to...
Yeah, thanks, Polly. It's Claire Hedin, but no biggie.
Sorry.
It doesn't look like it sounds. So as a musician, I had this fantasy the other day about how quiet it would be on the South Bank, and how easy it would be to play a concert at normal levels, and people from much further away would be able to hear it, because the sound competition, the noise levels would be so reduced. And from there, it made me think about, well, what if we actually did concerts where the whole point was that the surrounding landscape had to get quieter in order to hear it? So instead of us amplifying ourselves and having a noise and sound decibel level competition, that we reduce. Because one of the things I think most of us have been able to notice is the level of natural sounds that has become more audible and more present, probably both, because it's not in competition anymore with the digitized soundscape that we tend to live in urban environments. And I just love the idea of genuine audience participation by everyone having to shush down and become more sensitive. And that has an absolute correlation to the natural environment also feeling like there's room for it to emerge into its own. So that, I don't know what we'd call them, like the listening project or something, but you know, something about the sensitivity and sound being used as a way to stay connected to that after we get noisier again collectively.
Lucy, you've got a hand up. Let's unmute you, Lucy. There you go.
Yeah. Hi, hello everybody. Dan, hi, I just wanted to ask, if I may, a question directly to you about the prize to transform the future, in terms of when you say that there will be help offered for particularly projects and initiatives and visions. It was just the process of working with a local authority is incredibly complex, because when you're looking at land and land use, you're dealing with practically every single you know, council person and councillors and politics, and you know, it's a tangle historically, past, present and future. And I just wondered, I know this is emerging, but it was just whether you had a word about that in terms of how these prize visions might land with local authorities.
Yeah, it's more that we don't know what the visions are that people will come up with. And so the commitment is more around saying, if, for example, the vision really needs to get in front of Marion Spain, who's the new CEO of Natural England, then that's who will get the vision in front of. If, on the other hand, it's like Berkeley Homes, and it's more about, you know, a new development, then we'll try and get the vision in front of them, or maybe it's schools, or maybe it's the Prime Minister, who knows. In terms of help, it's more that the prize will be that we'll make sure that the winning entrants are given lots of visibility and exposed to those groups to try and make sure they get some traction and some stickiness. But we're not necessarily offering support around connecting with local authorities. Although now you mention that, that is something that maybe we could help with, especially the AONBs and the national parks, but also, yes, maybe local authorities in London. And I can instantly think of some, like Hackney, for example, that are very innovative in this space. So if anyone on this call would like to be connected through to a local authority anywhere within the south of Britain, and I know that that's come up as a controversial point in the comments here, but we're thinking about London as a global city and its impacts, positive and negative, rather necessarily as its cultural identity, then we can try and make those connections.
I would just like to thank everybody who's shared and joined and participated in the session today. It's been really invigorating and really inspirational, and just incredibly warm thanks to Jane, to Margot, to Anne-Marie and to Dan for your input and all of your visions. And we look forward to taking this forward as we reimagine and remake our city. Thank you so much. Thank you, Polly, and thank you, Culture Declares Emergency as well, for hosting.
And just to remind people that tonight we have a practical session with artist Tamarin Payne. So if you fancy actually taking your activism that you're holding on to during lockdown and doing something with it, then join us at 7:30. And then next week, we have 2 more fantastic sessions. The evening is actually a continuation of this session in a way, and we'll be asking people to take a wander through the forest, and we're going to have, even if it's just a virtual forest, and we're going to have contributions that encourage people to engage very directly with the trees around them, because it's the Urban Tree Festival next week. So do keep an eye on all of our social media. Do come along to other sessions. And yeah, thank you very much, Heather, for guiding us through today.
Yeah, and thank you to Dan, and thank you very much to you as well, and all our contributors. Thank you. Thanks so much.